Welcome back to Jays Central, your number one source for all things Toronto Blue Jays. Today we're diving into a potential roster move that could address one of the last remaining questions surrounding this team as we approach opening day. Before we get started, make sure you hit that like button right now. It really does help the channel reach more passionate Blue Jays fans like yourself. And stick around until the end because we're going to break down every aspect of this situation, and I want to hear your thoughts in the comments section. Let's talk about where the Blue Jays currently stand after an incredibly active offseason. Management has been aggressive in reshaping this roster, making several significant additions that signal championship intentions. The front office clearly learned from their deep playoff run and identified specific areas requiring upgrades to get over the hump. What we're seeing is a team that's not content with just competing. They want to win it all. The financial commitment has been substantial, with the organization investing hundreds of millions of dollars in new talent. We're talking about a combined total approaching $330 million in new contracts distributed across multiple players. That level of spending demonstrates ownership's willingness to support a championship push, and it gives the front office the resources needed to compete with big market powerhouses. On the pitching side, Toronto has absolutely loaded up with quality arms. The rotation now features an impressive blend of proven veterans and emerging talent that can match up against any opponent. When you look at the 5 pitchers expected to comprise the starting rotation, you see a legitimate strength that should keep this team competitive in every series. That kind of depth is essential for surviving the marathon of a 162-game season. The offensive additions have been equally impressive. Toronto brought in a power-hitting third baseman from international markets who immediately addresses a positional need while providing middle-of-the-order protection. That acquisition creates a ripple effect throughout the entire lineup, improving the quality of at-bats for everyone in the batting order. When you have multiple legitimate threats, opposing pitchers can't simply pitch around 1 or 2 dangerous hitters. However, one notable departure has created a void that needed addressing. The Blue Jays lost their starting shortstop, a homegrown talent who had been a fixture in the lineup for several seasons. While losing any quality player creates challenges, it also opens opportunities for roster construction creativity. The front office has responded by identifying internal and external solutions to fill that gap without sacrificing overall roster quality. Before we continue, drop a comment right now telling me your initial reaction to the Blue Jays offseason so far. Are you excited about the direction? Concerned about any specific area? I genuinely want to hear from the Jays Central community about how you're feeling as we approach the new season. The current projected lineup shows how pieces are falling into place across the diamond. At shortstop, the organization is expected to turn to a player acquired through trade who brings defensive excellence and solid offensive production. This isn't a stopgap solution or a desperate reach. It's a legitimate starting caliber player who can hold down a premium defensive position. That kind of seamless replacement minimizes the impact of losing the previous starter. Third base will be manned by the new international acquisition, creating stability at a position that's been somewhat fluid in recent seasons. Having a defined starter who can provide power and run production from that spot in the batting order is significant. It allows the coaching staff to construct lineups with confidence rather than constantly juggling personnel to find optimal combinations. The rotation depth is perhaps the most impressive aspect of this roster construction. Beyond the 5 expected starters, Toronto has additional arms who could step in if injuries strike or performance lags. That organizational depth is what separates contenders from championship teams. You can't predict injuries or slumps, but you can prepare for them by having quality options ready to contribute when called upon. The outfield configuration presents an interesting puzzle that we'll explore in depth shortly. Toronto has accumulated more quality outfielders than available starting positions, creating what's commonly known in baseball circles as a good problem to have. Multiple players with legitimate major league ability competing for playing time elevates everyone's performance and provides the manager with tactical flexibility. What stands out about this roster construction is the balance. The Blue Jays haven't simply thrown money at one area while neglecting others. They've systematically addressed needs across pitching, offense, and defense. That holistic approach to team building is what creates sustainable success rather than temporary spikes in performance. Smart organizations think comprehensively about roster construction, and Toronto has clearly done exactly that. Yet despite all these improvements, one area remains somewhat uncertain as opening day approaches. The bullpen hasn't received the same level of attention as other roster components, and there are legitimate questions about whether the current relief corps can handle the pressure of October baseball. Late-game situations often determine championships, and Toronto may need to address this vulnerability before the season begins. Let's dive deep into the outfield situation, because this is where things get really interesting from a roster management perspective. Toronto currently has 7 players with legitimate claims to outfield playing time. That's not a typo. 7 players competing for 3 starting positions. This surplus creates both opportunity and challenge for the front office as they finalize the roster before opening day. The center field position appears relatively settled, with a defensive specialist expected to man that spot. This player brings elite glove work and base running ability that makes him invaluable despite not providing massive offensive production. In today's game, where defensive metrics are increasingly valued, having someone who can cover ground and make highlight reel catches in center field provides tangible value that impacts run prevention. Left field presents a different scenario entirely. The organization made a significant financial commitment to a power-hitting outfielder, signing him to a multi-year deal worth over $90 million. After an injury-plagued first season that limited his impact, both player and team will be hoping for a healthy, productive campaign that justifies the investment. When fully healthy, this player brings legitimate middle-of-the-order power that can change games with one swing. The right field situation is where roster construction gets creative. With the new third baseman now occupying that position in the infield, a player who had been transitioning to the hot corner is being pushed back to the outfield. This creates a cascading effect where other positional players must adjust their expected roles. It's a delicate balancing act that requires clear communication and player buy-in to avoid clubhouse friction. Additionally, there's a veteran presence who's moving into a full-time designated hitter role after years as an everyday outfielder. This transition preserves his bat in the lineup while acknowledging that his defensive value has diminished with age. It's a smart move that extends his productive career while opening outfield opportunities for younger players. Managing veteran transitions gracefully is an underrated skill that separates well-run organizations from dysfunctional ones. Make sure you've hit that like button if you're following along with this analysis. And drop a comment telling me which of Toronto's outfielders you think should be starting on opening day. Who would be in your ideal outfield configuration? I want to hear different perspectives from the community. Beyond the obvious starting candidates, Toronto has several depth options who bring different skill sets to the table. There are players who provide speed and defensive versatility, others who offer left-handed bats off the bench, and utility types who can fill in across multiple positions. This depth is valuable during the regular season when injuries and rest days create opportunities for rotation players. However, having 7 outfielders on a 26-man roster is simply not feasible. Roster construction requires balance across all positions, and dedicating too many spots to one area creates vulnerabilities elsewhere. The Blue Jays need relievers, backup infielders, and catching depth. Something has to give, and that's where trade possibilities enter the conversation. One player who's emerged as a potential trade candidate is a versatile performer who saw significant action last season. This player posted solid offensive numbers across 80-plus games while demonstrating the ability to play multiple positions. That versatility makes him valuable, but it also makes him an attractive trade chip for teams looking to add flexibility to their rosters. His profile is particularly interesting because he hits from the right side of the plate, which remains in demand across baseball. Left-handed power is easier to find than quality right-handed bats, creating market dynamics that could work in Toronto's favor. A team desperate for right-handed offense might be willing to part with valuable assets to acquire this player, and the Blue Jays should absolutely explore that market. The beauty of trading from surplus is that it allows you to address weaknesses without sacrificing organizational depth in the area you're trading from. Even after dealing this player, Toronto would still have 6 outfielders competing for playing time. That remaining depth provides insurance against injuries while maintaining competitive roster construction. It's classic addition by subtraction, improving the overall roster by reallocating resources more efficiently. There's also the financial consideration of carrying extra major league salaries on the roster. Every player occupies not just a roster spot, but also payroll space that could be utilized elsewhere. Trading a surplus outfielder opens financial flexibility that could be redirected toward addressing the bullpen or other areas requiring attention. Smart roster management involves these kinds of strategic resource allocation decisions. The question becomes which team might be interested and what they'd be willing to offer in return. League-wide needs and organizational philosophies vary dramatically, creating potential trade matches that might not be immediately obvious. A team in the National League Central, for instance, has been identified as potentially interested in adding right-handed offensive production. Their needs align perfectly with what Toronto has available. Now let's talk specifically about the bullpen and why addressing this area should be Toronto's top priority before opening day. Relief pitching wins championships. That's not hyperbole or exaggeration. It's demonstrated fact based on years of playoff results. Teams that can't protect leads or keep games close in the late innings simply don't survive October baseball. The Blue Jays experienced this reality firsthand during their playoff run. Currently, Toronto's relief core features some quality arms, but lacks the depth and versatility needed for sustained success. There are two left-handed relievers on the roster, which provides some platoon options, but one of those pitchers has primarily been used as a swingman who could transition to starting if rotation injuries occur. Relying on him as a primary left-handed relief option creates vulnerability if starting depth is tested. The other left-handed reliever showed promise during the regular season, but struggled mightily when October arrived. His postseason ERA ballooned to over 11, demonstrating the challenge of performing under playoff pressure. While one small sample doesn't define a career, it does raise legitimate questions about reliability in high-leverage situations. Championship teams need relievers they can trust regardless of circumstances. This is where the trade scenario becomes particularly compelling. There's a veteran left-handed reliever playing for the National League Central team we mentioned earlier who could be available. This pitcher posted an impressive ERA just above 2 last season, demonstrating consistent effectiveness against both left-handed and right-handed hitters. That kind of production from a relief arm is incredibly valuable in today's game. What makes this reliever particularly attractive is his contract situation. He's entering the final year of his current deal, which creates interesting dynamics for both teams involved. The team currently employing him might prefer to trade him now while his value is high rather than risk losing him to free agency next winter without compensation. That's a classic baseball trade scenario where both sides can benefit. Before we go further, hit that like button if you haven't already. And drop a comment telling me whether you think Toronto should prioritize bullpen help or if you'd rather see them address a different area. I'm genuinely curious what the Jays Central community thinks about roster priorities. From Toronto's perspective, acquiring this reliever would provide exactly what they're missing, a proven left-handed option who can handle high-leverage situations. His track record suggests he can pitch in the 7th, 8th, or 9th inning, depending on matchups and game situations. That flexibility is invaluable for managers trying to navigate the final 3 innings of close games. The financial commitment would be manageable since he's only under contract for 1 more season. Toronto wouldn't be taking on long-term payroll obligations that might restrict future flexibility. If the partnership works brilliantly, they could explore an extension. If it doesn't pan out, they've only committed resources for 1 year. That asymmetric risk-reward profile makes this type of acquisition attractive. The proposed trade framework would involve sending the versatile outfielder we discussed earlier in exchange for the left-handed reliever. On the surface, this might seem like Toronto is giving up a productive player for a relief pitcher, which historically fans resist. But context matters enormously when evaluating trades. The Blue Jays would be trading from surplus to address a need, which is exactly when trades make strategic sense. Let's examine what Toronto would be losing versus what they'd be gaining. The outfielder provided solid production but was unlikely to receive significant playing time given the roster logjam. His value to Toronto is limited by the lack of available at-bats. In a different organizational context where he'd play regularly, his value would be much higher. That's where trade opportunities emerge, finding teams who value your surplus more than you can. Conversely, the reliever would immediately slot into a high-leverage role where he'd pitch in critical situations regularly. His contribution to winning would be direct and measurable, potentially making the difference between advancing in the playoffs or going home early. When you're championship hunting, impact in critical moments matters more than depth that sits on the bench. The remaining outfield depth would still be substantial even after the trade. Toronto would have multiple options for rotating players through starting positions, providing rest days for veterans and replacing injured starters. The depth that initially seemed excessive would become optimal after addressing the relief pitching need. That's smart roster construction, maintaining adequate depth while eliminating redundancy. There's also the development consideration for the player being traded. Moving to an organization where he'd receive regular playing time could be beneficial for his career trajectory. Sometimes the best thing for a player is finding a situation where opportunity exists. From that perspective, a trade could be win-win. Toronto gets needed bullpen help while the player gets a chance to establish himself as an everyday performer. My final take on this situation: the Blue Jays should absolutely explore trading from their outfield surplus to address bullpen needs. The specific trade framework we discussed makes sense for both organizations involved. Toronto would be transforming a positional logjam into a legitimate relief weapon without sacrificing competitive roster construction. That's the definition of smart asset management. Championship windows are finite, and Toronto's window is open right now. The roster has been upgraded across multiple positions, creating legitimate title aspirations. But if the bullpen can't hold leads in October, none of those other upgrades will matter. Addressing this vulnerability before opening day should be the front office's top priority as spring training approaches. All right, Blue Jays Nation, that's the complete breakdown of Toronto's roster situation and potential trade scenarios. Before you go, 3 critical things. First, smash that like button if this deep dive provided value. It genuinely helps the channel grow and reach more fans. Second, subscribe to Jays Central if you want comprehensive Blue Jays coverage all season long. Third, and most important, drop a comment with your take on this potential trade. Would you make this deal? What would you do differently? I read every comment, and I love the engagement from this community. Thanks for watching Jays Central, and let's go Blue Jays.